A man on the brink of losing everything was saved not by another soldier, not by a neighbor, but by a German shepherd collapsing at his doorstep in the middle of a raging snowstorm. In Bend, Oregon, winter can bury hope under endless white, but sometimes God places a sign right in front of us. Michael Reed, once a decorated soldier, now a broken man drowning in debt and guilt, was ready to give up on life when this dog appeared. Ranger, carrying not just frost on his fur, but a message tied to the past, a clue that would unravel betrayal, hidden truths, and a path to redemption. This is not just a story about survival. It's about how loyalty can bridge the gap between despair and faith, and how miracles often come in the form of four paws and an unyielding gaze. What happened next shook a town, exposed a corporation's darkest secrets, and restored a man's lost soul. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, hit subscribe if you believe loyalty still saves lives, and write Amen if your heart is ready for this journey. Have you prepared a cup of ginger tea or coffee to walk with us until the very end? The storm clawed at Bend, Oregon, drowning the town beneath endless sheets of white. Wind howled down Main Street, rattling shuttered shops and carving drifts higher than parked cars, as though nature had decided this outpost in the Cascades had no right to exist. Inside the storm's fury, Michael Reed sat in the dim interior of his cabin on the town's edge, listening to the glass panes vibrate in their wooden frames. Every tremor another reminder that the world outside was hostile, merciless, and indifferent. Michael was 41, once a soldier, a ranger who had trained his body into steel and his mind into discipline. Years of combat had left him tall and broad-shouldered, but neglect had whittled away his strength. His frame, once powerful, had grown wiry and hollow. His brown hair, cut short out of old habit, was streaked with gray, a contrast to the dark beard that sprawled across his jaw. That beard was unkempt, patchy in places, and shadowed a mouth almost always set in a grim, unspeaking line. His eyes, blue, deep, weary, were his curse. They carried ghosts, so many of them, but the most haunting was Daniel Cross, the man who had been his brother in arms until one firefight 7 years ago in the mountains of Afghanistan had turned Daniel into nothing more than a memory buried in the dirt. Since then, Michael had retreated into Bend like a ghost hiding among the living. He took odd jobs when he could, but never long enough to stay employed. His temper, once even, had soured into bitterness, and his sense of purpose had dissolved into something gray and shapeless. He lived in a wooden cabin his father had once owned, its shingles curling, its porch sagging. It was less a home than a bunker against the world, though not one nearly as strong as the fortifications of his past life. The foreclosure notice lay crumpled on the table in front of him. He had read the words again and again, as if repetition could change them. Failure to remit, notice of default, immediate eviction. They cut deeper than bullets. He had survived ambushes and explosions, but he had not survived civilian life. The irony pressed down on him, heavier than the snow piling against the door. He rubbed his hands over his face, the skin dry and cracked from years of cold winters. He thought of Daniel, as he always did when despair threatened to bury him. Daniel's laughter had been a weapon of its own, sharp enough to cut through fear. "You worry too much, Mike," Daniel would say, grinning in the dust and smoke. "We'll always find a way." But Daniel hadn't found a way. The insurgents had, and Michael had carried his body home in a flag-draped coffin. That failure was the root of all the others. A sound broke through the storm, faint, irregular, like scratching. Michael froze, his instincts flaring. For a second he thought it was just the wind clawing at the siding, but then it came again, more insistent, coupled with a low, muffled whine. He pushed himself up, joints aching from too many nights of poor sleep on a worn-out mattress. His boots thudded across the floorboards as he approached the door. When he pulled it open, the blizzard forced its way inside, snowflakes stinging his face like shrapnel. And then he saw it. A German shepherd collapsed against the threshold. Its body trembled violently, patches of its coat caked with ice. The fur was mottled gray and black, thick yet weighed down by snow, its sheen dulled by exhaustion. One paw hung limply, as if injured, while the other legs tried feebly to keep it upright. Its eyes, though, amber, startling, unwavering, locked onto Michael's with a focus that startled him. Michael's first thought was that the dog had wandered from one of the ranches outside town, lost in the storm. Yet there was something about its gaze, steady and unyielding, that unsettled him. It wasn't the vacant stare of a stray begging for help. It was sharper, more deliberate, almost commanding. He knelt, his hands moving with automatic precision, the old muscle memory of a medic in the field. His fingers checked for broken bones, for wounds hidden under the fur. The dog shuddered but did not resist. Around its neck was a collar unlike any he'd seen in stores, woven paracord, thick, durable, crafted in a king cobra knot. Recognition struck him like a blow. His unit had spent nights in Afghanistan weaving cords like that, idle hands making symbols of brotherhood in a land that wanted them dead. Michael's breath caught. His heart pounded as though he had been thrown back into the firefight where Daniel had died. He whispered, almost without knowing why, "Where did you come from, boy?" The dog gave a low whine, softer now, as if it understood. Michael pulled it inside, slamming the door against the storm. The cabin filled with the sound of ragged breathing, his and the animals. He fetched a bowl of water, slid it across the floor. The German shepherd lapped at it thirstily, then lowered itself onto the rug near the fireplace, the amber gaze never leaving Michael's face. In the silence that followed, Michael's mind raced. He told himself it was coincidence. A paracord collar could have been made by anyone. The dog could have wandered from anywhere. And yet, why here, to his door, in the middle of the worst storm of the year? Why did its eyes feel like they carried a message, a weight beyond mere survival? He tried to dismiss it, but the unease burrowed deeper. For 7 years he had lived in exile, convinced his life had ended with Daniel's. Now, a dog, this dog, had arrived like a ghost from the past, carrying memories he had tried to bury. Michael leaned back against the wall, staring at the animal. The fire crackled weakly, but it wasn't enough to dispel the cold that had crept into his bones. The German shepherd shifted, its body shaking off melted snow, its muscles rippling beneath the coat. It looked strong despite the exhaustion, a veteran survivor of battles Michael couldn't yet imagine. And still, those eyes watched him, steady, unyielding, as though waiting for him to make a choice. Outside, the blizzard roared, swallowing Bend whole. Inside, in the flickering light of the fireplace, a man who had given up on life and a dog who had somehow found him sat locked in a silence heavy with ghosts. Michael's pulse quickened. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest echo of something he had lost long ago, the pull of a mission, the sense that fate had not finished with him. But fate was cruel, and as the night deepened, a thought pierced his fragile hope. What if the dog wasn't a gift from Daniel's memory? What if it was bait, an omen not of redemption, but of disaster yet to come? The storm outside screamed louder, as if answering him. Michael stared into the animal's amber eyes and felt a shiver crawl up his spine, the kind that told him nothing in his life was going to remain ordinary after tonight. Michael sat at the edge of the worn armchair, the firelight flickering across his tired face, throwing shadows that deepened the hard lines etched into his skin. His eyes remained locked on the dog stretched across the rug. Ranger had finished the water and now lay with his head resting on his paws, the thick coat of gray and black fur slowly drying in the warmth. His breathing was steadier, less ragged than when Michael had dragged him in from the storm, but his amber eyes never once wavered from their fixed gaze on the man. It was the kind of stare Michael remembered from patrols in Afghanistan, when a soldier awaited orders or silently warned that danger was near. That, more than the paracord collar, unsettled him. The collar. Michael's fingers tightened around the memory of it. The thick olive paracord, woven in the king cobra knot, was no store-bought accessory. It was the kind of thing soldiers crafted in the dead hours between missions, each loop and braid a piece of shared identity, a bond forged out of dirt, blood, and exhaustion. Daniel Cross had been the best at it. Daniel's hands, quick, deft, always restless, had made them for the whole squad. Michael remembered receiving his, the way Daniel had grinned and said, "Now you've got more than a rifle keeping you alive." The sight of the knot around Ranger's neck now churned Michael's gut. Rational thought said it was a coincidence, that some rancher in Bend had once served overseas and passed the habit along. But the part of Michael that had survived ambushes in burned-out villages whispered something darker. This was not chance. He stood, pacing the cabin, his boots creaking against the floorboards, his shoulders hunched with tension, his hand brushing over the stubble on his jaw. He had spent years trying to bury Afghanistan under layers of silence and whiskey. But here, in the middle of a storm that threatened to wipe Bend off the map, a ghost had scratched its way back into his life. "You're not real," he muttered under his breath, though his eyes flicked back to Ranger as if daring the animal to prove otherwise. "You're just a stray, just lost." The dog stirred, lifting his head, ears pricking at the low tone of Michael's voice. Ranger gave a soft whine, the sound carrying a strange note of recognition. Michael's chest tightened. He shook his head, furious with himself. He had spent too many nights chasing Daniel's voice in his dreams, waking up to an empty cabin, the echo of orders and laughter fading before dawn. This dog was just another hallucination, a cruel trick played by memory and grief, and yet the dog would not look away. Michael raked a hand through his graying hair, pushing away the flood of recollections. He turned to the table, snatched up the foreclosure notice, and crumpled it tighter. His life was already unraveling. Now his mind was unraveling too. He imagined telling someone in town, anyone, that Daniel's dog had appeared on his doorstep 7 years after his friend's death. They would pity him, shake their heads, whisper that Michael Reed had finally gone mad. Maybe they would be right. But madness did not explain the way Ranger moved when he rose to his feet. The dog's muscles rippled with deliberate strength, his gait measured and precise despite the exhaustion. He walked to the door, stood, and looked back at Michael. Not scratching, not barking, just waiting. It was a soldier's gesture, a signal. Come on. Time to move. Michael's throat tightened. Daniel's been dead for 7 years, he said aloud, the words tasting like ash. You can't be his. Ranger tilted his head, as if confused by Michael's refusal, then pressed his paw gently against the wood of the door. The sound, just a faint thud, sent a shiver down Michael's spine. He had seen patrol dogs in combat zones do the same thing when they found a trail, or when they marked a hidden cache. Always deliberate, always meaningful. The storm outside screamed against the walls, but Michael's cabin felt even more suffocating. He dragged his hands down his face, torn between the desperate desire to ignore what was happening and the bone-deep instinct that something larger was at play. For a moment he allowed himself to imagine Daniel's voice, low and steady, urging him on. Follow him, Mike. Trust him. He cursed under his breath, pacing again. I'm losing it, he said, voice rough. That's what this is, just my brain, finally cracking open. The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks upward. Ranger did not flinch. His amber gaze remained locked on Michael, steady, patient, unnervingly human in its intensity. The weight of silence thickened until Michael couldn't stand it anymore. He stormed to the door and yanked it open, snow whirling inside like an angry tide. The wind howled, slashing his face, and the night beyond was a swirling wall of white. Ranger stood firm, the fur along his back bristling as the storm clawed at him, but his stance was unshaken. He stepped one paw into the snow, then looked back, a clear summons. Michael's heart pounded. He had sworn he would never again follow anyone into the unknown, not after Daniel. Yet here he was, with a dog whose very presence was a violation of logic, beckoning him into the storm. He almost laughed, a bitter, broken sound swallowed instantly by the wind. You want me to follow you out there? Into that? Ranger did not move, did not waver, only waited. Michael slammed the door shut, chest heaving. His hands shook as he pressed them against the wood. He could not, would not, step back into a mission. Not for a dog, not for a ghost. He had failed once, and the price had been his brother's life. Never again. But even as he tried to convince himself, the truth gnawed at him. He had seen the collar. He had heard the deliberate paw against the door. He had felt the weight of those amber eyes, carrying a message he could not yet decode. Exhaustion dragged at him. The old familiar kind that came not from physical strain, but from the relentless war inside his mind. He returned to the armchair, dropped into it heavily, and buried his face in his hands. For minutes, maybe hours, the storm and the silence blended until he wasn't sure which was louder. When at last he looked up, Ranger was no longer by the door. The rug where he had lain was empty. Panic shot through Michael. He scanned the cabin, his pulse racing, and found the dog sitting at the small, scarred table directly in front of the foreclosure notice. The paper had uncurled from its crumpled shape, spread flat as if placed there deliberately. Ranger sat with his head high, eyes fixed on Michael, his paw resting lightly against the corner of the paper. Michael froze. His mouth went dry. The symbolism was too sharp to ignore. This wasn't just a stray collapsing at his doorstep. This was something else. A message. A reminder. A demand. His chest tightened until he could hardly breathe. His voice was little more than a whisper. What the hell are you? The dog's eyes burned in the firelight, and in their amber glow, Michael thought he saw Daniel again, Daniel alive. Daniel urging him towards something larger, something inevitable. The illusion was gone in a blink, but the shiver that crawled down his spine remained. The storm screamed louder, and the cabin seemed smaller, darker, more suffocating. Michael leaned back, his gaze never leaving the dog, his mind teetering on the edge between disbelief and surrender. Somewhere deep inside, a soldier's instincts stirred from the grave. And then Ranger shifted, standing slowly, deliberately, and walked back to the door. He pressed his paw against it again, that same steady thud echoing through the wood. Michael's pulse hammered in his ears. The thought clawed through his mind, impossible yet undeniable. Maybe this wasn't madness at all. Maybe it was the beginning of something Daniel had left behind. But if it was, then what waited for him in the storm? The storm had not relented. Snow still whipped against the cabin, drumming the roof like endless artillery fire. Michael Reed stood at the threshold, staring at Ranger, who pressed his paw against the door once more, patient yet insistent. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths as the echoes of the last few hours weighed heavy on him. He could not decide whether he was slipping into madness or standing at the edge of something that would tear his life open again. But somewhere miles away, another soul had already been pulled into the same orbit. Claire Dawson, 38, was hunched over a battered laptop in her Portland apartment, the glow of the screen painting her face in pale light. She was tall and slender, with sharp features that had once been softened by laughter, but were now carved by long nights and endless deadlines. Her dark auburn hair fell past her shoulders in loose waves, though strands often hung in her face, forgotten as she typed furiously. Her hazel eyes, restless and probing, carried the weight of someone who had seen corruption up close too many times and had chosen to keep fighting even when it nearly destroyed her career. Years ago, she had known Daniel Cross, not well, but enough to remember his steady manner and the quiet conviction he carried. Tonight, an anonymous email had arrived in her inbox, its subject line a single word: Valhalla. The attachment was a fragment of data, half-corrupted, riddled with errors. But one thing had stood out in the recovered text: the name Michael Reed. Claire had leaned back, chewing the inside of her cheek, heart hammering. She knew the name, a ranger who had vanished from military records after Daniel's death, a man dismissed in whispers as unstable. She shut the laptop and pulled on her coat. The snow outside Portland was heavy, but nothing compared to the reports of the blizzard hammering Bend. She told herself it was insane to drive into it, but the story pulled at her like a riptide. If Daniel's name was attached to secrets worth hiding, if Michael Reed was alive in Bend, then perhaps the truth was buried beneath the storm. Claire was no stranger to danger. She had been threatened, sued, even once cornered in a dark alley by men trying to silence her, but she had never walked away. Not when lives were ruined by the powerful. Not when the truth begged to be told. Back in Bend, Michael finally relented. He pulled his coat tight around his shoulders, boots crunching against the snow as he followed Ranger into the storm. The dog cut a determined path through the drifts, moving with uncanny certainty. Michael's breath plumed in the freezing air, and his legs protested with every step, but he forced himself forward. For 7 years, he had been adrift. Now, with every paw print ahead of him, he felt tethered again, though to what, he could not yet say. They left the glow of the town behind, the lights swallowed by darkness. The world shrank to the narrow path, illuminated by Michael's flashlight, snow swirling like ghosts at the edge of the beam. Ranger stopped once, looking back, eyes glowing amber in the light, then pressed on toward the looming silhouette of the Cascades. Hours passed before they reached it. A cliff face rising sheer from the ground, black stone jutting like the wall of some ancient fortress. The storm howled around them, but here, the wind seemed to bend, funneling downward in strange currents. Michael frowned, brushing frost from his beard. The wall looked solid, impenetrable. Ranger, however, walked straight to a narrow cleft and pressed his body against it, pawing the stone with deliberate force. Michael followed, one hand tracing the rock. His fingers caught on a faint groove, too straight to be natural. A cold dread filled him. He pressed harder, and with a groan that cut through the storm, the stone shifted inward. A seam appeared, widening slowly, revealing a dark passage carved into the mountain itself. Cold air swept from within, but it was different, sterile, metallic. Michael staggered back, heart hammering. "What the hell is this?" Ranger waited, tail still, body rigid as though standing guard. Michael's instincts screamed at him to retreat, to turn back before the past devoured him whole. But curiosity, that old soldier's compulsion to uncover the unknown, pulled him closer. The passage yawned wider until it was large enough for him to step through. Inside, dim emergency lights flickered to life, casting a pale glow on steel walls. The floor was smooth concrete, the ceiling lined with cables and ventilation ducts. It was not a cave. It was a facility, hidden in plain sight, designed by someone who had known exactly how to bury secrets. Michael's stomach clenched. Daniel. Only he could have built something like this. Paranoid, meticulous, always thinking 3 steps ahead. But Daniel was dead. And that left Michael with a terrifying conclusion. If Daniel had built this, then he had known he might never return. His boots echoed as he stepped into the corridor, Ranger close by his side. The air smelled faintly of dust and oil, like an engine long dormant, but waiting to roar back to life. Michael reached a door and pushed it open, revealing a chamber filled with filing cabinets, old monitors, and a generator humming faintly in the corner. Papers were scattered across a desk, yellowed with age but still legible. One word leapt out at him from the top of a folder: Helios Defense. Michael's vision tunneled. Helios Defense. He remembered the whispers, the contracts gone wrong, the accusations buried under classified seals. He felt the old bitterness rise, bile in his throat. His pulse thundered as memories collided. Daniel laughing in the desert sun. Daniel crafting paracord knots by lantern light. Daniel bleeding out in the dirt. He stumbled back, gripping the edge of the desk, the thought striking him like a rifle round. Daniel had known. Daniel had left all this behind, and Ranger had brought him here. But doubt twisted through him, venomous. Maybe it wasn't Daniel's work. Maybe it was a trap. Helios had enemies, rivals, shadows in every corner. What if they had built this, seeded the clues, lured him here to finish the job his guilt had already started? Ranger's ears pricked, his body tense. He growled low, staring back at the corridor. Michael's hand went to the knife he still carried out of habit, though it had been years since he had used it. His breath misted in the dim light as the sound reached him. Footsteps, faint but deliberate, approaching through the passage. Michael's heart pounded. His mind conjured soldiers, mercenaries, the faceless killers Helios might send to bury secrets. But when the figure appeared in the doorway, it was not a soldier. It was a woman. She was tall, wrapped in a heavy coat dusted with snow. Auburn hair clung damp to her pale face, and her hazel eyes burned with curiosity and caution. She carried herself not like a fighter, but like someone who had walked into too many dark places and survived them by sheer will. She looked at Michael with sharp recognition, her voice cutting through the silence. "Michael Reed." Michael froze, knife still in hand, every nerve taut. "Who the hell are you?" "Claire Dawson," she said, breathless from the cold and the journey. "I knew Daniel, and I think he left this for you." The words struck like another blow. Ranger growled, Michael's pulse thundered, and the storm outside raged on. He stared at her, caught between suspicion and the impossible weight of hope. But before he could demand answers, the lights in the chamber flickered violently, plunging them into momentary darkness. Somewhere deeper in the facility, a mechanical whir began to stir, slow and deliberate, as though something long asleep had just been awakened. The hum of machinery echoed faintly through the hidden chamber, the sound hollow and unsettling, as though the mountain itself were waking from a long slumber. Michael Reed stood rigid, one hand gripping the hilt of his knife, the other resting against the cold steel of a cabinet marked with faded military stencils. The flickering emergency lights painted his face in harsh intervals, exposing the deep creases around his eyes, the salt and pepper in his beard, the exhaustion carved into every line of his body. Ranger sat alert at his side. The German shepherd's ears pricked, amber eyes darting between Michael and the woman who had just walked through the door. Claire Dawson shed her snow-dusted coat, her chest rising with quick breaths as she adjusted to the stale air of the facility. Her tall frame gave her a presence that demanded attention, even in the dim light. The auburn strands of her hair clung damp to her pale cheeks, and her hazel eyes narrowed with both curiosity and suspicion. She looked at Michael as though he were a puzzle piece that didn't fit, her jaw set in a line of distrust. Years of chasing corruption had trained her to expect deceit, and tonight she found it staring back at her in the form of a man once whispered about in scandal. Michael broke the silence first, his voice low and rough, like gravel dragged across concrete. "What are you doing here? How did you even know this place existed?" Claire's lips parted, but her words came measured, cautious. "I got an email, anonymous. It had Daniel's name, and yours. There was data attached, corrupted, but enough to point me here." She scanned the room, her eyes falling on the folders, the old monitors, the generator humming in the corner. "And clearly, someone wanted me to find this." Michael's knuckles whitened around the knife. He didn't like coincidences, not after years of ambushes hidden in shadows. "Or someone wanted to lure you here. You don't walk into a place like this and call it luck." Claire folded her arms, straightening her spine, hazel eyes burning. "Then explain this to me, Michael. Why is your name tied to Daniel's death? Why does every trace of that operation end with you walking away while he ended up in a coffin?" The words hit harder than a bullet. Michael's shoulders stiffened, his gaze darkening. Memories crashed in, unbidden. The chaos of gunfire, Daniel bleeding out in the dust, Michael screaming into a broken radio. He swallowed, the knife lowering slightly, but still clutched in his hand. "I didn't kill him," he said, voice cracking with rage he could barely contain. "I tried to save him. I carried him until there was nothing left to carry." Claire didn't soften. Her profession had taught her that denial was often the first line of defense for the guilty. She stepped closer, her boots echoing sharply. "Then why did the records disappear? Why do the reports say you abandoned your unit? Why does every scrap of evidence make you look like the one who betrayed him? Michael's chest heaved, his breath fogging in the cold air. His eyes, normally guarded, flared with a dangerous light. Because someone needed a scapegoat. Because Helios Defense wanted to cover their tracks. He spun, slamming a folder down onto the table so hard, the dust lifted like smoke. Look at this. Daniel knew. He found proof they were selling intel to the enemy. That's why he's dead. And that's why they buried me along with him. Claire's fingers hesitated before she touched the folder, flipping through its contents. The documents were stamped with logos she recognized. Helios Defense, a private military contractor with fingers in every conflict zone. Memos, transmission logs, contracts, the kind of evidence that could ruin powerful men. But part of her still clung to suspicion. She looked up at Michael, her eyes narrowing. Convenient. Too convenient. You produce evidence after hiding for 7 years? How do I know this isn't forged? The accusation cut deep. Michael staggered back, his hand running down his face. His mind screamed with self-loathing. Maybe she was right. Maybe everything he touched turned to ash. He had failed Daniel, failed to clear his name, failed even to keep his own life from crumbling. The foreclosure notice at home was proof enough of his failures. What was the point of trying to fight anymore? Ranger growled low, the sound reverberating through the chamber like a warning. His amber eyes fixed on Claire as though sensing the tension threatening to ignite. Michael dropped heavily into a chair, his shoulders slumped, the knife clattering onto the table. His voice was almost a whisper. Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm nothing but a ghost they left behind. A screw-up who let his brother die. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the generator and the distant moan of wind funneled through the mountain. Claire studied him, her eyes softening despite herself. He didn't look like a man hiding secrets. He looked like a man drowning in them. His broad shoulders, once built to bear the weight of war, now sagged under invisible burdens. His hands trembled slightly, the calluses of a soldier still etched into them, reminders of a life he couldn't escape. Still, doubt gnawed at her. She had chased too many leads that ended in betrayal. If you want me to believe you, then prove it, she said, her voice firm. Show me something Daniel left behind, something that ties this to him and not to you. Michael's head lifted slowly, his eyes narrowing. He reached into a drawer, pulling out a small notebook worn with age, its leather cover frayed. He slid it across the table toward her. This was Daniel's, his handwriting, his codes. You think I forged this too? Claire's breath caught as she flipped through the pages. The neat scrawl, the shorthand, the sketches of paracord knots, details too intimate, too personal to fabricate. Her heart pounded. She remembered seeing Daniel jot notes in a similar style during briefings years ago. For the first time, her certainty wavered. Before she could speak, the facility shuddered, a deep vibration rolling through the floor. Dust trickled from the ceiling, and the emergency lights flickered violently. Ranger leapt to his feet, growling, his body tense. Michael's head snapped toward the corridor, instincts sharpening in an instant. Claire gripped the notebook tightly, her hazel eyes wide. What was that? Michael's face hardened, the despair replaced by a soldier's focus. We're not alone. The corridor beyond the chamber darkened as the lights cut out one by one, plunging the facility into shadows. From somewhere deeper inside came the metallic clang of a door unlocking, followed by the slow, deliberate echo of boots on concrete. Michael snatched up his knife again, his breath steadying, the old rhythm of combat returning to him. Claire clutched Daniel's notebook to her chest, torn between fear and the dawning realization that Michael Reed might be telling the truth. And then, as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, the lights died completely, leaving them in absolute darkness. The darkness inside the facility was thick, pressing in like a living thing. Michael's breathing was steady, controlled, but his muscles coiled with tension as though preparing for an ambush. Ranger's low growl reverberated in the chamber, a sound that promised violence if necessary. Claire Dawson clutched Daniel's notebook to her chest, her hazel eyes wide though the dark concealed the worry carved across her face. The silence broke with a sudden shriek. The facility's alarm system roared to life, red lights strobing along the walls, accompanied by the metallic clang of reinforced doors sliding open deeper in the complex. Michael's instincts screamed. Someone else had activated the systems. He barked at Claire, "Stay behind me!" As Ranger bristled, teeth bared, hackles rising. The sound of boots struck the concrete floor, rhythmic and deliberate, the cadence of professionals who knew exactly how to advance through hostile ground. From the shadows emerged the first figure, Richard Hale. He was 46, tall and broad-shouldered, his build still military hard, though age had carved deeper grooves across his angular face. A scar sliced from his left temple down across his cheek, a permanent reminder of a convoy ambush he had once survived by sacrificing his own men. His hair, cut close, was streaked with gray, and his steely eyes carried the detached coldness of a man who no longer believed in loyalty. Hale had once been an Army intelligence officer, but whispers of brutality and insubordination had ended his career. Helios Defense had been waiting, and in their employ he had flourished, shedding the last remnants of conscience. Hale raised a gloved hand, and behind him 8 mercenaries fanned out with precision. The Omega Team. Each man moved with lethal efficiency, clad in tactical armor marked with Helios insignia, faces obscured by black balaclavas. They carried suppressed rifles, sidearms, and blades strapped to their thighs, weapons gleaming under the pulsing red lights. They were predators, trained to hunt without hesitation. Michael's stomach twisted, but he forced himself upright, his voice calm despite the adrenaline. "Helios sent you, didn't they?" Hale's lips curled in a thin smile, though no warmth touched his eyes. "Not Helios," he said, his voice smooth and icy, the kind of tone that carried menace even without volume. "Me. Helios may write the checks, but this is personal. You should have died in that desert with Daniel. Instead, you're here sniffing where you don't belong." The words struck like knives. Michael gritted his teeth, but before he could answer, Ranger lunged forward, barking ferociously, his powerful body angled to shield both Michael and Claire. Hale's gaze flicked briefly to the dog, an amused disdain crossing his scarred face. "Still hiding behind someone else to fight your battles, Reed? First cross, now the mutt." Michael's pulse hammered, but his voice came steady. "Step 1 foot closer, and you'll see just how wrong you are." The mercenaries moved, rifles snapping into position. Bullets sprayed as Michael dove behind an overturned metal desk, dragging Claire down with him. The chamber erupted with gunfire, sparks flying as rounds ricocheted off steel. Ranger darted forward with terrifying speed, slamming into the nearest soldier and sending him sprawling, jaws snapping down on an armored forearm. The man screamed as Ranger tore the weapon free, tossing it aside before lunging again. Michael's old instincts surged back to life. He rolled from cover, knife in one hand, pistol in the other, a weapon he had stashed long ago but never thought he'd use again. He fired twice, each shot deliberate. One mercenary dropped, clutching his chest. Another staggered, hit in the shoulder. For the first time in years, Michael moved not as a broken man, but as a ranger once more, precise and deadly. Claire, trembling, crawled toward the far wall, trying to stay out of the crossfire. She wasn't a soldier. Her body was built for endurance at a keyboard, not battle. But she was sharp, quick-minded, and desperate to survive. She pulled herself behind a console, clutching Daniel's notebook as though it were armor. The fight was chaos. Ranger dragged down a second mercenary, his massive frame crashing both of them into the wall. Michael engaged another hand-to-hand, slamming the man's head into the steel cabinet before wrenching his rifle away. For a moment, it seemed the tide could turn. Then the shot rang out. Claire's scream tore through the chamber as a bullet grazed her side, knocking her to the ground. Blood bloomed quickly across her coat, stark against the pale light. Michael froze, his chest seizing. The mercenary who had fired grinned behind his mask, raising the rifle again. Time slowed. Michael's mind fractured between choices. Drag Claire to safety and risk leaving the fight to the mercenaries, or stand his ground and unleash hell, knowing she might bleed out in the shadows. His grip on the rifle tightened until his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded with the weight of responsibility, the memory of Daniel's lifeless body flooding back. He had already failed one friend. Could he bear to fail again? Ranger growled, standing over Claire, his body poised to defend her, amber eyes blazing with determination. The German shepherd's stance was not just protective, it was expectant, waiting for Michael to choose, to reclaim the part of himself he had buried. Hale's voice cut through the chaos, smooth and venomous. "So what's it going to be, Reed? Run like before? Or fight and watch another die because of you?" Michael's chest heaved, torn between rage and despair. His eyes flicked to Claire, her hazel gaze clouded with pain but burning with something else. Belief, faint but there, that he could be more than his failures. The chamber reeked of smoke and gunpowder, echoes of gunfire still rattling the steel walls. The Omega mercenaries shifted, tightening their formation, rifles trained on him. Hale stood at their center, arms crossed, calm as a predator watching his prey cornered. Michael raised the rifle, his jaw clenched, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his old self returning. But whether he could protect Claire and survive against Hale's men was another question entirely. The red lights flickered, the alarm wailed, and Michael's finger hovered over the trigger as the world seemed to hold its breath. The cold gnawed at the steel walls of the underground chamber, the alarm still wailing its shrill warning. Smoke hung heavy in the air, mingled with the metallic tang of blood. Michael Reed crouched low behind a scorched console, Claire Dawson bleeding near the far wall, her pale face twisted with pain, but her eyes refusing to close. Ranger stood like a sentinel before her, his fur bristling, amber eyes locked on the mercenaries forming up under Richard Hale's command. For the briefest instant, the thought of escape crossed Michael's mind. He could drag Claire through the maintenance tunnels and vanish into the blizzard, leave the ghosts and betrayals buried. But when his gaze met Ranger's, the German shepherd gave a low growl that felt like a command. No retreat. Not this time. Michael rose to his feet, rifle braced, every sinew in his body quivering, not with fear, but with a grim clarity. He barked a sharp order, not to Hale, but to Ranger. The dog sprinted across the chamber, leaping onto a pressure plate hidden in the concrete. A concussive charge detonated, hurling two mercenaries back in a shower of sparks. Michael pivoted, using the chaos to his advantage, firing controlled bursts that forced the others to scatter. For the first time, the Omega team looked uncertain. Claire groaned, clutching her wound. But when Michael glanced at her, she shook her head firmly, mouthing the words, "Don't stop." That defiance lit a fire in him he thought long extinguished. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her, for Daniel, for the years he had wasted drowning in failure. Hale, however, did not falter. The man advanced with predatory calm, his scarred face illuminated by the pulsing red lights. He barked commands that cut through the noise, rallying his soldiers. One of them, narrow shoulders, nervous eyes visible behind his mask, hesitated too long. Hale struck him across the helmet with the butt of his rifle, snarling, "We are wolves, not sheep." The soldier steadied, fear sharpening his aim, and Michael realized Hale ruled through terror as much as skill. Michael lured them down a narrow side corridor, one hand brushing the old stone walls. Daniel had left this place prepared, traps embedded in the infrastructure. With a flick of a switch on the wall panel, a cascade of heavy steel shutters fell, separating the mercenaries into smaller groups. Ranger charged one section, tackling a masked man into the wall. The man was tall and broad, but years of strength training meant little against the full force of a trained 10-year-old German shepherd with scars of his own. Gunfire rattled, echoing off stone, the smell of ozone thick as Michael moved with relentless precision. He fought not like a man trying to survive, but like a soldier executing a mission. For every bullet he fired, every movement he made, memory returned. Nights in Afghanistan when Daniel had whispered, "We always find a way." Hale pursued him through the labyrinth of the facility, his icy composure unshaken. Finally, Michael reached the emergency exit tunnel, the one that led to the open wilderness. A bitter wind howled through the crack in the door, carrying snow that swirled into the chamber. Hale stepped into view at the far end of the hall, his rifle raised, his voice carrying. "You should have stayed broken, Reed. You had your chance to fade into nothing. Now you'll die trying to be something again." Michael's chest heaved, exhaustion pulling at his limbs, but he tightened his grip on the rifle. "Better to die standing than live on my knees." He fired, bullets striking sparks from the walls as Hale advanced, calm and precise, forcing him backward through the exit. The night outside was brutal. A frozen canyon stretched before them, its walls sheer ice that gleamed under the pale moonlight. Snow whipped around them, cutting visibility to a blur. Here, amidst the jagged cliffs, two soldiers faced each other. Hale was relentless, his movements mechanical, each shot measured, each step purposeful. Michael stumbled, breath ragged, his body screaming for rest. He thought of Daniel's last moments, of Claire's blood staining the floor, of all the years lost to grief. His knees buckled, rifle slipping in his hands. Hale raised his weapon for the killing blow, his scarred face twisted in cruel satisfaction. Then Ranger exploded from the darkness, a gray and black blur of muscle and fury. The German shepherd slammed into Hale with bone-jarring force, teeth sinking into his forearm, wrenching the rifle away. Hale shouted in rage, struggling, but the dog held on with unyielding power. Michael seized the moment, dragging himself upright, lunging forward with a roar that tore from his chest like thunder. He drove Hale backward into the icy wall, fists and fury raining down. The two men grappled, breath steaming in the frozen air, boots scraping on slick stone. Hale's strength was formidable, his training merciless. But Michael fought with something Hale could never understand. A purpose born not of money or power but of loyalty, of promises to the dead and living alike. At last, Hale faltered, his body crashing onto the ice, Ranger standing over him, growling deep in his throat. Michael stood trembling, rifle clutched tight, his breath ragged clouds in the bitter night. For a long moment, he thought Hale might rise again. But the man lay still, beaten, his cold eyes staring up at the endless blizzard above. Behind him, Claire staggered into the canyon, her coat soaked with blood, but her steps steady, determined. She had managed to drag herself out, refusing to be left behind. Her voice, weak yet clear, carried through the storm. "Michael, Daniel trusted you. He always did. I was wrong." Her words cut deeper than any bullet. For 7 years, Michael had believed he had failed his friend. Now, with the storm raging around them and Hale defeated at his feet, he finally allowed himself to believe otherwise. He wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a soldier reborn. Yet as Ranger barked once, ears pricked toward the ridge above, Michael's eyes followed and froze. There, through the swirling snow, the silhouettes of more mercenaries appeared, black shapes descending like wolves. The fight was far from over. The canyon still echoed with the roar of the storm, snow cascading in thick sheets as Michael Reed steadied his rifle against the fresh silhouettes emerging on the ridge. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, but his mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in years. Ranger growled low, tail stiff, ears pointed toward the advancing mercenaries. Beside him, Claire Dawson staggered but refused to fall, her pale face bloodless under the moon's glow. She had pressed her jacket hard against her wound, and though her lips trembled from the cold, her eyes were unyielding. The reinforcements began their descent, but something shifted in the storm. A distant hum grew louder until headlights cut through the snow. Vehicles, black and unmarked, pushed into the canyon, their tires crunching the frozen ground. For a moment, Michael thought more Helios forces had come, but then a commanding voice boomed through the blizzard. "Federal Task Force, drop your weapons now!" From the lead vehicle stepped Special Agent Robert Mason, a man in his early 50s with a square jaw framed by a neatly trimmed gray beard. His eyes were deep-set, sharp, the kind of eyes that had measured lies and truths for decades. He wore a thick, tactical jacket, his broad shoulders giving him the stature of authority. But the slight limp in his left leg betrayed old injuries. Mason had spent years chasing corporations that thrived in the shadows, and Helios defense had been at the top of his list. His voice carried both steel and fatigue, the sound of a man who had seen too many betrayals. The mercenaries hesitated, caught between Hale's fall and the sudden arrival of federal agents. Mason's men moved with precision, surrounding them. One by one, weapons clattered to the ground, the arrogance of Helios soldiers dissolving into submission. Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding, as though sealing the moment of surrender. Michael lowered his rifle, his body still tense, uncertain if this was salvation or another trap. Mason's gaze locked onto him, and though suspicion lingered, there was also a flicker of recognition. "Reed," Mason said, voice heavy with memory. "Daniel spoke of you once, said you'd either be the one to save him or the one to haunt him." The word struck Michael like a physical blow. For so long he had carried the weight of failure, the belief that Daniel's death was his fault. Now, hearing Mason confirm Daniel's trust, something inside him loosened. Claire, leaning heavily against the icy wall, whispered, "You see, Michael, he never doubted you." The hours that followed blurred into a flurry of arrests, confiscated files, and dismantling of what remained of Helios's hidden base. Mason's agents uncovered encrypted servers, weapons caches, and the final fragments of Daniel's data. Claire, though weakened, insisted on cataloging everything, her journalist's instincts blazing even through the haze of pain. With Mason's help, she pieced together the full story. Helios Defense had deliberately sold intelligence that compromised missions overseas, directly causing Daniel's death. The revelation was damning. Michael watched as Claire typed feverishly on her battered laptop, her auburn hair falling loose from the hastily tied bun. She looked fragile in that moment, but the determination etched in her green eyes made her seem unbreakable. When she finished, she sent the files directly to her editor in Portland, knowing the story would explode across every major outlet by dawn. Her fingers shook not just from cold, but from the weight of responsibility. This was no longer just about Daniel, Michael, or even her. It was about exposing a rot buried in the nation's defense. By the time the sun pierced through the storm clouds, Bend was quiet. The federal task force had secured every surviving mercenary, including those too stubborn to surrender. Richard Hale, battered and unconscious from his duel with Michael, was shackled and loaded into a transport vehicle. Michael stood silently, staring at him, the man who had embodied everything he despised: ambition without loyalty, strength without honor. Ranger sat at his side, fur matted with snow and blood, his amber eyes fixed on Michael as if reminding him that justice, at last, was served. The facility collapsed hours later. Explosives planted within the walls, Daniel's failsafe, detonated in sequence, sealing the secrets of Helios under tons of ice and rubble. Michael and Claire stood side by side, watching the plume of snow and smoke rise into the air. For Michael, it felt like a burial, not just of Helios's crimes, but of his years of guilt. Claire, pale but resolute, laid a hand on his arm. "I'll protect your name," she said softly. "The world doesn't need to know what you carried on your shoulders, but they'll know Daniel died a hero." Michael's throat tightened, words caught in the knot of his chest. He could only nod, grateful beyond expression. When it was time to leave, Mason arranged for transport back to Portland. Michael climbed into the battered pickup provided by the task force, Ranger leaping into the passenger seat with effortless grace. The dog shook the snow from his coat, curling into the seat as though he had belonged there all along. Michael glanced at him and, for the first time in years, a real smile curved his lips. It wasn't wide, it wasn't carefree, but it was genuine, a fragile ember of peace glowing in the wreckage of his life. Claire stood near Mason, her laptop clutched to her chest, already planning the story that would shake the country awake. She raised her hand in farewell, her eyes meeting Michael's one last time. It was not goodbye, but an unspoken promise that their paths would cross again. As the truck rumbled forward, the storm finally broke. Sunlight spilled across Bend, glinting off snow-laden roofs, painting the ruined town in fragile gold. Michael kept his eyes on the road, one hand steady on the wheel, the other brushing Ranger's thick fur. For the first time since Daniel's death, the road ahead did not feel like a march into darkness. It felt like a beginning. The pickup rolled out of bend, tires crunching over ice, disappearing into the horizon where the sky opened wide. And for a brief, fleeting moment, Michael believed he had been given not just survival, but a second chance at life.